If you have an encounter with God, it's going to give you the endurance to heal, because it's really hard to heal. Hi, my name is Georgia Downey, and I am the CEO of Glory House of Miami. And we get the honor of providing long-term restoration to survivors of sex trafficking, female survivors, one heart at a time. That's our motto. And I would love right now to introduce Dr. Jennifer Davidtz. Hello there.
Hi there. I'm Jen Davidtz. I'm a clinical psychologist and an associate professor at Nova Southeastern University. I direct a specialty clinic that specializes in providing services for folks with serious mental illness and with complex traumatic stress disorders. And I'm really excited to be here to have this conversation with Georgia.
Yeah.
So thanks for having me.
Yeah, honestly, it's an honor, to be in this podcast, and I'm super grateful to talk to an expert like yourself. And I think, everybody's going to get they're going to have a lot of new wisdom about what happens with these survivors, and even from a psychological perspective.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk to you too, and that to collaborate. Hopefully this is the beginning of a lot of more conversations and work together. So Georgia, for those who might not fully understand what human trafficking looks like today, can you give us a bit of a sense of the landscape of it, how it happens, especially here in Miami, and what it's looking like today?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people think that trafficking is only happening in these third world countries, or it's only happening to marginalized individuals, and that's just not the case. Sex trafficking is happening in our neighborhood, in our backyard. It is a crime that is happening in plain sight, and I can guarantee without fail that you have walked by a victim at the grocery store, at the mall, at the park, because unfortunately by the time, as you know, they're walking around, there has been such psychological trauma and mind control that they can walk around in plain sight. And so I just think it's so incredibly important to bring awareness to this. Although I know it's a very heavy topic, it's very nefarious, of course, but we don't want to serve another survivor. We want to end this. And the only way we're going to end this is if we bring awareness to it.
Yeah. You were talking about these folks just being among us, in plain sight. Do you have a sense of some of the signs that people might be able to notice? I know we see that there are signs on bathroom doors in airports and in other places and storefront, but what can we keep an eye out for, and what might give somebody an idea that someone isn't safe?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I always tell people to go firstly with your gut. If you feel something is off, better to be off and wrong than off and right and not actually reach out to law enforcement, right? But generally, almost similar to a domestic violence victim. So they're gonna have an insecurity, an anxiety maybe you sense, looking down, not having an ID. Maybe they are with another gentleman and you can see that something's even off in the communication. But I think ideally what we tell people is, if you feel something's off in your gut, trust that. Yeah,
the gut is always, that's what I say in the clinical context too, and it's hard to, sometimes people want more tangible. How do you know certain things? And it's like you have to trust your intuition sometimes, and that's your best guide.
Yeah, and a lot of times traffickers, which, it's at minimum $150 billion crime industry. So there's massive money, that's being moved around all across the world. But if you think about it, they are essentially incredibly intelligent. They're businessmen, they're business women, right? And so to have that level of, quote, revenue means that although they're using it for evil, essentially, they're very smart. And traffickers are very smart in how they actually are able to groom their victims as well. And I would love just for everybody to know I think one of the questions I get all of the time is how is a survivor, or a survivor who is still a victim, they're still being trafficked, how can they walk around in plain sight? Why don't they run? I think that's a question that a lot of people have from a psychological perspective.
Yeah. It has to do with coercion primarily, and everything that goes into the pattern of coercion in a relational context. I think people don't realize the complexity of the relationship that survivors, or sometimes the term victims is used for when they're still in captivity, right? And then survivor once they're out of captivity. But I think people don't realize how complicated their relationship with their captors is, and that the captor, in the context of coercive control, is the provider of both love and nurturance and cruelty and abuse. And that makes it very complicated. So that's one thing. The other thing is that they don't have independence. Whatever money they make is not their money. They don't have an independent place to live. They don't have social supports that are outside of the trafficking context. They might have other people that they're connected to, but they're not social supports outside of that context that they could reach out to. And depending on when they were trafficked, they may or may not have sort of some basic life skills. So if they were very young when they were first trafficked, they didn't learn ways of living in the world that allowed people to have independence. And of course, another part of the coercive control is threats. If you leave, this is going to happen. There's a whole network. I think what you were talking about in terms of the business of it and the comprehensiveness of the infrastructure, it really is kind of everywhere. It's like this hidden web, and people who are in it kind of know that. They're told that. They're reminded of it constantly, that, you know, that they need to. Or also, if there are people, sorry, I didn't even finish that sentence, but if there are people that they care about who are also trafficking victims, then they worry about harm coming to those people if they leave. So if they were to try to escape, they know that somebody else is going to get punished for it, and they have a bond with those other people. But I'm wondering what you would add. I think you actually work in real life with survivors in a way that I don't do. So what do you see in terms of why folks don't leave, why it's not so simple?
I think it's exactly what you say from a psychological perspective. You know, we've had survivors where, you know, you start making friends, for lack of a better word, with the women who you're being trafficked with, and so there's threats against those friendships. And unfortunately, I know this sounds super dark, but survivors have seen them be killed. And that's the fact, you know. And so if your family's threatened, you know, they already have your ID, they already have your history. There's, like you said, a level of vulnerability that they have prior to being trafficked that leads them, like you're saying, to not understand and navigate the world in a healthy way. And so I think all of those things, including fear, is what keeps a survivor bound.
You know? Also like a failed attempt to flee. And the prospect of what might happen in the way of punishment if that happens.
Definitely.
With over 40 million people trafficked, how do you intervene at the community level? How do you start to make your way in to make a difference?
Bringing awareness to also communities that think they're safe, that their daughters are safe, their granddaughters are safe, their nieces are safe. I mean, and you know, boys are trafficked as well. But going against or bringing awareness to the stereotype, right? Coral Gables, Coconut Grove, Brickell, you know, I'm talking about Miami right now. Traffickers are targeting these areas. So this sense of safety that we might have walking in the Grove or walking in Coral Gables is a false sense of safety. In fact, I usually tell this fact when I start talking with someone that recently, as of last year, Coral Gables is the highest reported zip code that traffickers are actually targeting. And so this misnomer that, this is happening far away from me, and my daughter's safe, my granddaughter's safe is not true. I think also the second thing in terms of awareness is, for whatever reason, people think that trafficking is prostitution and that there's their own free will involved. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Of course, trafficking is through force, fraud, or coercion. There has to be an exchange of goods. But they're not able, like you said, to keep their money, to go home every day like they're having a 9-to-5 job. And so it's not the same thing. And I think that's really important to have people understand. And then I would say the third thing in terms of bringing awareness is, yes, at Glory House, we absolutely, when we start serving a survivor, we want to protect them. We want them to have the space to heal. But isolation is very common. And we want them to experience the value of community. And I know that, of course, you have to mentor a survivor or be their buddy. You have to be trained and go through extensive training. But we want people to serve, because if you serve, you're going to realize that the women that come into our office are beautiful and smart and lovely and have dreams and goals just like we all do. And I think that's also shocking as well, to see that what you have, have a stereotype in our heads, which we all do, right? The women that come into our office, you would say there's no way she's a survivor. And so I think that's really important to kind of break that stereotype.
So you get members of the community involved in the services that are provided and in the mentoring and support.
Absolutely. And even if that comes to churches, partner organizations, or just individuals, they don't understand self-care very well. So we have volunteers bring, self-care items and toiletry bags. We have even kids in high school write cards to them on Valentine's Day. We celebrate them. We want them to start experiencing what, quote, normal life looks like, and in the context of community.
Yeah. You mentioned churches, and I know Glory House has a strong faith-based foundation. Can you talk a little bit about how spirituality sort of features and what it looks like in the context of this process for survivors?
For us, we're focused on long-term restoration. And that can take some amount of time, right? And so there's physical healing, there's emotional healing, and we believe there is spiritual healing as well. We are faith-based. We would never force a woman to believe in a certain way, of course, but we believe that if you have an encounter with God, what that looks like for the woman, that it's going to give you hope. It's going to give you the endurance to heal, because it's really hard to heal. It takes a long time and it takes a lot of work. And so we want to bring God at the center and really show them the love of God. And that's really just through our actions as well.
You mentioned the long-term nature and the sort of complicated trajectory of healing. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like what? And I know there's no typical trajectory, but maybe there are some sort of commonalities for survivors. What does that look like?
For sure. Well, once a survivor is rescued, they go into what's called like emergency services, crisis services, right? And after they get out of that, they go to short-term support. A lot of times they have been on drugs. Either the trafficker has made them, or they have just, to survive, were on drugs during that horrific abuse that they went through. So rehab, of course, like you have to get clean, all of that. So emergency, short-term, and then what we do is that long-term support. And so most of the time, yes, survive. We need all of those. Like we need the people who serve in the emergency. We need the people who serve in short term and long term, of course. But a lot of times survivors actually reach out to us because they've run out of the level of support that they need. and they're still dealing with their trauma. They're still dealing with complex trauma, which I want to talk to you about in a minute, and PTSD, and they're having flashbacks and anxiety and panic attacks, and they can't keep their job. They can't get stable. And that's where we come in, and we really want to wrap around them and walk with them through that journey, a holistic journey of healing.
How do you help them connect with like medical services, with dental care, with like all of the basics that a lot of us take for granted?
Yeah, we have amazing partners, and you know, if you're out there and you want to partner with us, please do. We're always looking for new partners, but it's through that wraparound support that we are able to get them to a doctor and a dentist, help them with their car, help them with their rent. That's in-house services, but yes, we really heavily rely on our partners to help in the medical, physical aspect of it.
For the therapists out there, and for me, because I know it can be very difficult to get these folks to engage in therapy, to get them in the door to begin with, and then to get them engaged in therapy, especially in sort of traditional therapy, the way that we think about it. Do you have recommendations for us, words of wisdom for the clinicians out there who want to be helpful if we cross paths with the survivor, about like what should we know about how to connect with these folks?
That's a great question. Well, for us in our program, therapy is, they have to go through therapy to be in our program. Of course, most of them, and I'm going to get to your question, but most of them are terrified to do therapy, even though they know they need help. I think they think that they're actually going to destabilize versus actually get towards a stable life and a stable and sound mind. And so we really believe that mental health and everything clinicians do is imperative to how we can serve them as well. You know, if they're constantly getting panic attacks and having PTSD, it's really hard to sit with them during a care coordination meeting and say, hey, what are your goals for this year or next year? There are no goals because they're not stable. And so I would tell clinicians, start small. Start with letting them just talk, which we normally tell the women that we serve. You don't have to have trauma therapy at the beginning. Totally. Just talk about your day. Talk about how it was a hard day or a great day. But I think getting them talking and having a very slow relationship building with their therapist is really key. That would be my advice.
Yeah. You were saying they're terrified that they'll get destabilized, and I'm just thinking of what inherent wisdom they have that conveys, because they're right. If people rush too quickly into trauma processing, it is often destabilizing. And for many people, it's actually not required. It's not required to heal. There are different versions of treatment for trauma, of course, and different things work for different people, but sometimes people are scared to even hear about trauma processing and what that would look like, because they kind of know in their wise mind, intuition, that it could destabilize them. So
and I'd love for you to share with everyone what complex trauma is and PTSD and what that could look like serving a survivor, or just knowing a survivor. What does that mean, so everybody can understand that?
So complex PTSD is essentially PTSD plus some other symptoms, another constellation of symptoms. So typical or simple PTSD, as it's described in the DSM, involves a cluster of symptoms related to avoidance of stimuli that remind folks of a traumatic experience that they've had. Of course, it includes a traumatic event. That's criterion A. Avoidance of things associated with the event, hyperarousal, so overactivation of the nervous system, and re-experiencing, so either nightmares, flashbacks, those sorts of things, and then other dissociative symptoms like depersonalization or derealization as well for some people. Complex PTSD has all of that, along with significant disruptions in regulation of emotion, identity. So the Judith Herman talks about the way in which prolonged captivity almost can deform someone's identity, the way that they see themselves. And it doesn't deform them as a person, but it deforms how they see themselves. There's emotion or affect, identity, and then relationships. So there are significant difficulties in relationships, either with trusting people and being able to connect in relationships to begin with, or some complicated kind of moving towards and moving away from in relationships. So all of that has to be addressed for somebody with more complex traumatic stress.
How do you advise us? I'll take as much advice as possible, but just even people who want to serve, or even family members, and their daughter was trafficked and now rescued, but how do you build trust with somebody who's gone through that?
With patience, with authenticity, some balance of authenticity and really good boundaries, which can be a tricky balance sometimes, because, in therapy we have certain ways of working and we have the unique boundaries of the therapeutic relationship. It's not like any other relationship. The typical strictness of the therapeutic relationship with a therapist who is maybe by temperament or by training more removed and distanced and less authentic as a real person is not a great context for these folks, because they need to be able to read the person that they're sitting with. It's very important for them, and they actually are very perceptive. They know how to read people. And so when someone is intentionally not allowing themselves to be readable, for reasons related to technique or what we know about how therapy works and all of that, for good reasons, it's hard for someone who has a hard time developing trust. So we have to be able to be authentic, but we have to maintain the boundaries, because if we don't, if we bend or blur boundaries even a little bit, then we're not trustworthy.
Right.
Because again, with the perceptiveness of the survivor, they can see they've spent too much time and experienced too much suffering at the hands of people who are not trustworthy, adults who are supposed to know better and don't behave the way they're supposed to. So, and I know, obviously a therapist ideally would never grossly violate boundaries, but even small violations of things over familiarity, running over too much, starting early, not observing the frame of psychotherapy, could be subtle signs. Wait a minute, is this person, can I influence them? Are they corruptible? Because that's another thing that the survivor is having to heal from, their sense of their own culpability.
Yeah.
And they're not culpable. They're never culpable in this context, but they sometimes feel that they are. They've been told that they are. And sometimes it's part of the survival strategy to feel that they were culpable in some way, and if they could manage that and not do that again, then they would be safe in the future. Anyway, so we have to be, and sometimes these folks will push, not just survivors of trafficking, but anyone with complex PTSD will push the boundaries to see, to clarify and make sure intermittently that this is a safe space. So I don't know if I'm sort of making my point, but that it's a hard balance, because we want to be authentic, and we want to hold the good boundaries. So sort of doing that dance.
That was important. A brilliant answer, because we have to do that every day at Glory House. It's so tough, the boundaries. I always say truth in love, truth in love. And some days it's, tough love. And then other days it's try to be as sweet as possible, of course, always kind, but, because they're always testing our boundaries, which makes perfect sense. And they're so perceptive, like you said. Any sign of, I guess for lack of a better word, you might know the word psychologically, but incongruent, it's they'll pick up on it like that. Yeah. What do you think freedom looks like psychologically for a woman?
First thing that comes to mind is agency.
Yeah.
Someone having an internal sense of their own agency, that they can say yes, they can say no, they can make choices related to their life and what they want. and then even an awareness of what they want, which relates to identity too, you know, sort of knowing what their values are, what's important to them, what they want to pursue. And I think also like internal and external safety. You know, the first phase of like a 3-phase model for treating complex PTSD is safety and stabilization. And that's, you know, it's safe housing, safe relationships, being out of a space where abuse might occur. Like there's the physical safety, being sort of out of the woods in terms of seriously suicidal or self-injurious behavior or substance abuse that's very threatening to their well-being. So that's kind of the external safety, but then there's internal safety, which could also be the suicidal ideation, but internal safety is the sense of all parts of themselves being aligned with who they are, knowing who they are, and that can take some time and effort, but I think that's freedom comes. Without that, it's hard to feel like folks have freedom if you know, if they don't have an internal sense of safety and having their feet firmly planted on knowing like what they believe in, what's important to them, and with help and support, just like we all need, like what they want their path to be.
Yeah, that's great. I have a good question that I still don't have the answer to. So
I wonder if I will. We can talk about it. We'll find one maybe.
I have noticed that as much as we want people to volunteer and serve directly with the women, and like I said, there's extensive training that has to happen, there is a fear amongst volunteers that they're just not equipped to serve with the women. And for me, the most important thing is that they experience community and safe relationships, like you're saying. So what would you tell somebody, a prospective volunteer, how to get past the fears in your head that you're not going to be able to serve them the way that you want because it's so dark and it's so complex, and how can I really help a woman?
Appeal to the volunteers' own to basic humanity and remind them that like for everyone, the most important thing for a survivor is relationships and community, relationship with themselves too. And that's what the volunteers have. They are, that's one of their privileges, perhaps, that puts them in a position of being able to serve in this way, that they have a good support system, they have a good they have good relationships with people who are important to them, and that is an expertise that they actually bring into their work with the survivor.
Yeah, that's so good. I always tell prospective volunteers, hey, don't look at it from such a macro level. Look at it from the sense of there's something that you're going to identify with in their story. We all have some type of trauma that we've experienced, some type of experience that wasn't the best growing up, and it might look small to you, but it will be a connecting point when you're serving with that woman. Yeah,
like we're all fellow travelers.
Really. Yeah, we've all been through stuff, and so make it less extreme in our heads, and they'll be amazed that, oh my goodness, like this is wonderful. We're going to the movies and to get ice cream. Like this doesn't have to be as intense as I thought it would be in my mind.
It's like that's actually the best part of it. It's like what they'll be doing is like some of the most fun stuff, and they won't even realize like what a gift they're giving.
Absolutely, for sure.
Yeah. Georgia, you've been doing this work for years. You have lots of stories, I'm sure, that you can draw from to share with listeners. Is there one particular one that comes to mind?
Well, there's a few. I think that people want these gigantic wins, and we have those, but in the anti-human trafficking field, it's more of the small wins that encourage us. So we can go months serving a woman and think, is there ever going to be a breakthrough in her heart and her life and her thought process and her own desire to have a future? For us, it's the small wins, you know. We had a survivor realized after all these years that she's like, I'm smart. Like, I'm actually smart. I'm intelligent. Or I want to go to school, maybe not even back to school. They've never been to school. Or something simple, I blew out my hair today and I put on lipstick and I feel pretty. Getting a job and maintaining a job over 3 months, that's a win for us.
Huge.
That's a win for us. Them saying, we had another survivor, gosh, maybe last week or the week before, say, you know, therapy is obviously a part of our program, but we're not gonna force them, but it is a requirement, and finally say, okay, I'll do it. And she has never been so terrified of going to therapy, and finally there's that small breakthrough. So for us, it's kind of like the sun coming through the clouds, and you see that glimmer of hope, and that is almost a like rolling snowball. It builds on itself. And that's what encourages us.
Oh, thank you,
Jen. We obviously, like you've touched on, identity, loss of identity. We deal with that all the time serving these women. But in your clinical experience, how does a survivor start reconnecting with themselves and form that identity that is healthy? What does that look like?
I don't know if this is going to sound counterintuitive, but I actually think the most powerful mechanism for reconnecting with oneself is connecting with another, connecting with others. And what comes to mind is the attachment relationship in infancy. And I'm not an infant researcher or clinician, but I mean, we know from clinical writing and research that that's a lot of where identity, I mean, there's temperament and we're born somewhat who we are in some ways, but our identity develops via our interactions with our caregivers and how we learn about ourselves from our relationships with them. There are different theories about this, actually. Some think that we develop individually first and then we engage in relationships. Others believe that we are relational before we're anything else, and then we develop our identities from that. And maybe I'm a little bit more towards that. It's all theory, and we don't know. None of it's the truth, but that's my experience clinically. Two, of course, we can do things. I also think of practical strategies that are often really helpful for people. Grounding, basic grounding, and reconnecting with their bodies in some way, which sometimes is a very daunting process, even drawing attention to their body and doing a basic scan, which some of us don't even think twice about, like, oh, I'm going to do a quick breathing scan and see where I'm at. That can be very, very difficult for somebody who's had significant, like, physical or sexual abuse or emotional abuse, so any kind of trauma. Connecting with just, like, reminding themselves that they exist and that they're a person, and there are lighter ways to connect with the body that don't require an intense focus on sort of what they're feeling like. Well, and that helps them feel like they're sort of in the present moment. The relationship always, and I see that happen in therapy with folks with complex trauma histories. We have the therapeutic relationship first. That can take a while to develop. And then I start to see them finding themselves in their narrative. It's like they're starting to connect with themselves. The only other thing I'll add is connecting with emotion is important. That's an important part of the, like, working through the trauma, not trauma processing necessarily, though for some people that's helpful, but definitely being able to tell the story, integrated into who they are as a whole person, and connect with the emotions attached to the trauma, because once they connect with the emotion, they're connecting with themselves. For a lot of survivors, the only way to survive is to not connect with emotions. It's not even conscious some of the time. It can become conscious, but for the most part, it's an innate survival mechanism that just kind of takes over and takes care of things. But to heal, they've got to reconnect with their
for
emotions.
sure. That's, you know, I think people don't realize, you know, we see the movie Taken and we think, oh, survivors are like taken and kidnapped, and that definitely does happen. But can you touch on, because a lot of trafficking is familial trafficking, unfortunately. And so it is your dad, it is your mom, or somebody in your family that ends up selling you. when I tell people, oh, these women are vulnerable, but it's not necessarily that they're marginalized and living, like I said, in a third world country, which it absolutely does happen there too. But what does vulnerability look like that could lead a woman to be trafficked?
And to clarify, do you mean to be trafficked by a stranger or by...
Yes, I mean, I wanted to touch on that point regardless, that a lot of trafficking is familial. But when I go and speak at awareness events, you know, there's dads and moms there, and they're like, well, my child isn't vulnerable. Not to, you know, tell them, yes, she is, or yes, he is, but they are, you know, if there's a lack of self-esteem, not feeling valued within the home,
Totally.
like that.
Yes. It is. I mean, I keep coming back to relationships, which is like, anyone who knows me is not going to be surprised by that. But being connected, having social supports, or not having social supports rather, is a vulnerability factor. Not having the home be a safe landing spot. So for whatever reason, because there's some violation of boundaries in the home, or because there's abuse in the home, or because there's neglect. I mean, one of the risk factors, this isn't because of malice on the part of caregivers necessarily, but sometimes caregivers are more absent because they're for reasons related to needing to work and support the family and all of that. A net, like I think of the safety net, all of the things that make for a safety net for any of us, and it really is our connection with other people and our connection to ourselves, like having a sense of identity and knowing that we can have agency and we can observe boundaries of our own. I mean, I think some education around that really helps a lot too. If parents talk to kids about those things, if educators talk to kids about those things, just about the basics of boundaries. But when kids don't have that safety net, that's a vulnerability factor for sure.
And it's, you know, lack of community, a lack of a healthy network can lead you to, unfortunately, being trafficked, but it can also heal you. So it's so interesting how it can swing to the other side, right? And then that is actually in community and safe relationships, actually what helps a woman get healed enough to have the agency to dream again, you know? So that was awesome.
Georgia, on the topic of how people can help and how people can get more involved and get more information, can you share a little bit about that?
For sure. You can go to our website, gloryhouseofmiami.org. Reach out to us, fill out a form online, learn more about us. We'd love to have you serve, get connected to us if you're a business, a church, or just an individual who wants to serve. And we're also having our annual Fashion for Freedom this September. Would love to have you be a part of it.
Georgia, thank you so much for sharing your experience. I mean, your professional experience, but also your personal experience. You're clearly so personally connected to this work and to the survivors you work with. So thank you so much.
It's an honor, and thank you to Manor House, and thank you to Jen. You're such an expert, and I want to glean, like I said, any expertise as we go back to the work, and I'm super grateful for what you do as well.
Yes, thank you, and I hope we stay in touch. Hopefully we'll be collaborating.
It's happening.
And
for sure.
If you need volunteers, I'm there.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.